Hi class, welcome to lecture 4, part A. Today we're going to be talking about social theories of international relations. More specifically, we're going to break it up into two parts. Part A will be on the social theory that is constructivism, and part B will be the theory of Marxism. So let's go ahead and define what constructivism is. Now, again, we're talking about international relations theories. This will be our third one. We've talked about realism and we've talked about liberalism and the differences between them. Constructivism is a little bit different. I would say it errs more towards liberalism, but it is very unique. So we'll define it, and then we're also going to say how it critiques both liberalism and realism, and some of the critiques that realism and liberalism have against constructivism. Okay, so constructivism, we kind of got to get into the weeds here, not because it's an especially complex theory, but because it's a theory that requires some abstract thinking. Okay, so to start, we could say that the focus of constructivism is more on human consciousness or awareness, and how that consciousness and awareness internally can affect the international system, can affect world affairs, right? So we might say realism and liberalism are more materialistic, right? They focus on tangible things. For realism, that might be strength, right? And power, military size, diplomacy, population. And liberalism, it's still concrete material things, trade, collective security, international cooperation. Constructivism focuses more on, again, internal and the social aspects in individual countries. Okay, so the biggest point we need to make with constructivism is that it believes the reality, the social reality we create, and by proxy, the international reality we create, is not objective or external, meaning it is internal and subjective. Okay, so what that means is that influence in the international system starts within a country and is defined by that country's relationships with other countries. And also what is reality is going to be different in every single country. And that will also influence their behavior. So constructivists would say that international relations should focus on the ideas and the beliefs that inform actors in the international system. Okay, so a little bit different than realism and liberalism in that way. So constructivists would say the international system does not exist on its own. Again, we're looking in more of an internal way. I would say, similar to classical realism in that sense, that it's looking at the actors, but it's not looking at the actors necessarily from the point of decisions they're making and making conclusions. It's looking more at what causes the reality that makes states make those decisions. Okay, so it's getting more to the crux of the issue. Okay, that the international system is made up of ideas that lead to action in relationships, not necessarily material forces like the other two theories of international relations. Okay, so the international system, therefore, based on what we just said, is a human creation, and because it's a human creation, it is what we make it. Okay, our actions and beliefs and attitudes in the environment that we grow up in collectively all inform how we make decisions and therefore influence the international system. So constructivists might argue that because you can change your identity, because you can change your ideas and the way you think, you can influence the international system in that way. Even if one state changes its identity, it's going to influence the international system. If all states change their identity, we can really shape the international system in perhaps a more positive way or a negative way, depending on what those identities and relationships and attitudes are. So the makeup of every state, as I said before, does affect international behavior, right? So that's the connection to international relations. The internal affects the external, of course. And we might look at examples like Japan, right? Internal politics in Japan greatly influenced their external policies. If you look at Japan in World War II, it's extremely militaristic, right? To the point where surrender was seen as shameful and something that even after both bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a strong faction in the Japanese military that still did not want to surrender. It was that much of a cultural issue there that surrender was unacceptable. And we go to the post-war period, they've liberalized and they've become much more pacifist, and we've seen their role in international relations change from imperialistic to pacifist. So in that way, constructivists would say the internal affects the external. So again, we got to kind of get into the weeds here. So how does internal nature affect external relationships? Essentially through norms and practices, right? Norms and practices are what make up your nation, and of course that's going to affect your international decision making. Norms define actors or states by specifying their actions that will cause other actors to recognize them and respond appropriately. So what does this mean? It's a wordy sentence. Essentially, what you put out in the international system, you're going to see that through a certain lens, and other states are going to see that through a certain lens and respond accordingly. And it might be easier to look at this on a more of a micro level, right? Let's use an example. Let's say you get pulled over by a police officer for speeding, right? If the police officer comes to your door and you're just scowling at him, what do you want, right? He's probably going to react negatively. Now, of course, he might do that as well, and that might inform your actions. But if you're sweet and respectful, he might be more polite, and vice versa. If he's negative towards you, you might be more negative towards him. That's essentially what constructivism is saying, right? That other actors are going to recognize what is normal to you, what your behaviors are, and respond accordingly. So if you put your best foot out there, you're more likely to get a positive response in return. So these norms and practices, which we just spoke about, create what we call identities. And identities create what might be predictability. So based upon your norms and practices and your actions from those norms and practices, you create this identity. And then other states, even before you made a future decision, are going to try to predict your behavior based upon your norms and practices. And again, if we look at this at an interpersonal level, with you and your friends, right? Your past actions, how you conduct yourself, is going to lead to how they deal with you in the future, or at least what they expect from you, what they can predict you to do. So constructivists would say this is also true in the international system. How you've acted in the past, how you conduct yourself, the norms and practices that have created your identity are going to lead to a certain amount of predictability from other countries looking in. So now that we've established norms and practices and identities and how they affect international relations, we can say that if you want to truly understand outcomes, you want to truly understand a state, you have to understand their cultures, you have to understand their norms, practices, traditions, their cultural norms, what they are, which again shape identity and ultimately decision making. So to kind of summarize, to break down identity again, norms and practice create identity, which creates predictability. Identities are important because one, they tell others who you are. And of course, these identities are shaped over time by decision making. If you're someone who's always making aggressive decisions, other states are going to begin to expect that. And for a pacifist country, same thing, right? But the other way. So they tell others who you are. They tell you who others are by the same decision-making process, norms and practices and identities. And three, they display interest and preferences. So again, you're making decisions constantly in one way. Other states are going to know what your preferences are because of who you are, who your identity is. So let's get into constructivism's relationships to the other two theories, starting with realism. So Alexander Wendt, a prominent constructivist thinker, wrote in 1992, anarchy is what states make it. So this goes back to the idea of subjectivity, which we spoke about at the beginning of the lecture. Basically that anarchy is meaningless and completely subjective. So constructivists might say that, The international system is what you make it. If, again, let's go back to identity, let's go back to norms and practices. If you go into the international system thinking that it is anarchy, everyone for themselves, you're going to go in with that negative attitude. Going back to the example of a police officer pulls you over. And therefore, that's how other states are going to treat you, because that has become your identity. So it's in some ways a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you think it's going to be anarchy, it's going to be anarchy. On the other hand, if you approach it like it is more organized and less anarchic, then it's going to be that way as well. A lot of constructivists might say, again, anarchy exists if you think it exists. And they say in a critique of realism, to back up this idea that anarchy is subjective, they would look within different states and say, well, look, anarchy means different things in different states, in different communities rather. This is an inconsistency that doesn't really support realism's idea that the international system is anarchy, because what anarchy is to us in the United States might be completely different than what anarchy is in North Korea or in South Sudan or in Great Britain, right? To us, anarchy might have a completely different meaning. So constructivists look at it and say, well, realists, you say the international system is anarchy. What does that even mean? Can you define it? Is that definition consistent with other states' definitions of anarchy? And if not, doesn't that kind of disprove the theory in general? So again, constructivists would say anarchy only has meaning if we choose to give it meaning. Another constructivist critique of realism. We know that realists claim there is a balance of power. So when one state becomes too large, you're going to see smaller states band together to counteract that power, okay? Constructivists would look at this and say, no, they're not actually allying to balance against power. They're becoming allies to balance against differences in identity and practices. So they're coming together because they have similar cultural norms and identities and practices, whereas this strong power they're balanced against perhaps has a different identity that is not congruent, does not connect well with the states balancing against it. So they would say, we're not balancing against the threat of power, we're balancing against a state with a different identity, that therefore, because they're a different identity, again, from norms and practices, that we might identify them as a threat. So as I said before, constructivism certainly more similar to liberalism than realism, because they do believe in the importance of institutions, right? Because institutions, they might say, can create similar norms and practices and therefore similar identities. So that's the value of institutions, not necessarily, through maybe collective security or interconnected economies, but rather because the peace comes from the similar identities being created from working together. Okay, so similar outcome, but a different road to get there. Okay, so let's get into constructivism's critiques or views on liberalism. So we talked about democratic peace theory and liberalism, the idea that democracies do not go to war with one another. Constructivists would agree with this, but they don't say it's because of the democratic institutions necessarily. It might be part of it. It's because they understand each other's identities. They're similar types of government. They have similar ideals. They have similar norms. They have similar practices. Therefore, they tend to understand each other's identities better. And if you understand each other's identities better, you're less likely to fight. So it's not necessarily democracy itself that creates peace, but the fact that they have similar identities that create peace. So again, we're seeing a lot of similarities here with the end result, but they have a different way of explaining it. It's not the type of government, it's the similarity and identity. So we get also, going back, that we just critiqued realism and liberalism. Let's look at some of the critiques from the other side. How do realists look at constructivism? I would say they're more in opposition than liberalists for obvious reasons, a very different ideology. Realists would say they recognize norms. Okay, yes, norms are real, and perhaps they affect how people treat you and affect your identities. But when it comes down to brass tacks, power dominates overall. Okay, so let's say you're a country that has a similar identity to another, but you need something from that country. If you're the more powerful country, you're going to take it. Okay, and I think a good example of this would be the Malayan dialogue, right? We talked about that. We talked about realism, how, you know, they needed the island of Melos for strategic reasons. Even though they were very similar culturally, they took it and killed everybody because it benefited them. Okay, so historically, realists would say historical evidence points to the fact that the powerful have constantly violated the sovereignty of weaker states. And, you know, there's evidence all throughout history. You can go through the realist slides, you know, from Napoleon to Hitler to many European kings. The strong tend to dominate the weak. That would be a very strong realist critique. Same thing, very similar point here. A social interaction, realists might say, can be beneficial, but it's always going to be disregarded in the interest of power. Again, if country A is more powerful than country B and they need something done, they're not going to not do it because country B has a similar identity. They're going to look out for themselves, okay? Another realist critique of constructivism is, they would say constructivists always assume state actions are sincere, when in reality, that is not always the case. They're sometimes strategical. So again, going back to our realism lecture, we're talking about the prince, right? Machiavelli's the prince, right? He says you must be both the lion and the fox, right? What does that mean? I had a student ask me, talk to me about this, and it was a really interesting conversation. Essentially, you must be cunning like the fox and willing to trick like the fox, but also strong when necessary like the lion, right? So the good leader, according to Machiavelli, is going to be cunning sometimes, going to be coy sometimes. So you might lead people to believe you're buddy-buddy, or lead people to believe that you have the intentions, but in reality, your intentions are completely different. And you might throw that loyalty out the door when it benefits your state. And, you know, we've seen this historically represented as well. The example I use here, which I think is a great example, is the pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union during World War II. Hitler and Stalin had a pact of non-aggression. And as soon as it benefited Hitler, you know, he started to invade Russia, okay, despite the fact that he had made a pact not to do so. So realists would say, yeah, of course he's going to do that because he doesn't want Russia to be suspicious or worry about fighting on the Eastern Front when he's invading, you know, when he's invading Poland and France. But as soon as it suited him, he invaded the USSR, which obviously turned out to be a huge mistake. Never invade Russia during the winter. But the point being that states will mislead you for their own benefit. And perhaps the most damning critique of constructivism is the simple two-word statement, prove it. How do you prove that constructivism is real? Can constructivism offer historical examples to back up their claims? I mean, it's hard, right? Because you're talking about internal, somewhat subjective norms and practices and identities. It's very difficult to prove this because you don't necessarily know what people were thinking, if they had an intention that changed or they maintained an intention. It's harder than the other two theories to look and say, okay, this is obviously a case of realism, right? Or this is obviously a case of democratic peace theory working in liberalism. Constructivism is much harder to prove. Other critiques of constructivism, we're kind of going at constructivism right now, but I think it's worth exploring the strengths and weaknesses. You know, it's sometimes called more of an approach to international relations and not of a theory, again, because it can't really be disproved. To have, you know, a scientifically supported theory, you have to be able to disprove it. You know, that's in the scientific method, any scientific method, it has to be able to be proved or disproved. But how can you quantify the intentions and motivations of actors in a political system, right? With realism, you can quantify things, military size, population. With liberalism, you can look at democratic peace theory and say, okay, democracies don't fight. You can't really do that as well in constructivism. You know, you can use historical examples. It's just harder to prove once again. Okay, so that's going to wrap up part A of this lecture. I will get part B to you as soon as I can.